Welcome allesammans. I have a very exciting series for you all coming up, but first we need a little background history before we go into this 5-part series about the most exciting history in Scandinavian history. But some people think of Scandinavia as just a little barren wasteland at the edge of the world that nobody really cares about, especially in the Viking Age. They think that it's just a few small tribes of big Norsemen fighting against each other and making little tiny bitty attacks at the rest of the world when they go further south. But most people don't know exactly how powerful and influential Scandinavia was during the Viking Age. I know hearing that is already making a lot of you butthurt, and some of you are going to cry in the comments. So let's get into the little known history. How were the Vikings the number one fighting force in the world? So enough talk. The easiest way to do this is just go down the list. Let's look at the other military forces in the world at the time during the Viking Age and do an analysis. Of course, we can narrow it down to Eurasia, since nowhere else in the world at the time had kind of the technology or numbers or organization to compete. So we're looking at military forces in Europe or Asia during the Viking Age, which was in the year 793 until the year 1066. So let's break down the competition. First, let's get over the English. Now, I'm not going to lie and say that the English were dominated by the Vikings every time they fought, because the English did win some significant battles against, smaller armies and raiding parties of Scandinavians at the time. But they simply never stood a chance against a full Scandinavian army who actually came in with the goal of conquering and ruling. And that's no disrespect. I respect England actually more than any other country in the Viking Age, because they defended themselves from invaders from all sides, from Ireland, Scotland, the Normans, the Vikings, and they did it very well. The problem was, most of the Viking Age, England was divided into smaller kingdoms that didn't really unite until the Viking Age was almost over. So that made it basically impossible to stand against a legit full Viking army who was invading. And England was not just raided by the Vikings here and there, okay? They were under political Danish and or Norwegian rule multiple times in the Viking Age. There was the Danelaw in the 800s. Northumbria was ruled over by Norwegian King Erik Bloodaxe during the mid-900s, and all of England was under Danish rule in about a little after the year 1000 by Svein Forkbeard and his son Cnut the Great. This was for a number of years that England was actually under full Danish rule. Yeah, England was successful at fighting off small-sized Viking armies a couple times when they united, such as the Battle of Stamford Bridge, but the English lost shortly after that to the Normans, by the way, who were Viking descendants living in the north of France. And then the Danes came into England again after that anyway and challenged the Normans. So yeah, against a full united Viking army from Scandinavia, England simply didn't stand any chance during the age. Maybe before they did and after they did, but not during the Viking Age. On to the next competitor, the Franks. Now, this is a very important one, because just exactly before the Viking Age, the Franks were by far the number one force in the world, probably. And when they were led by Emperor Charlemagne, he conquered everywhere he wanted, basically. After he died, though, right at the start of the Viking Age, the Franks were never the same. Guys, I don't even have to tell you how bad the Vikings ravaged Francia with no challenge whatsoever. But again, a lot of people associate the Vikings with just raids, like they ravaged a small town and ran away before Frankish fighting forces could retaliate. Anyone who thinks that has not read anything about the age. We have, for example, the winter raids of 882 and 883, and the decades surrounding it. They're called raids, but really it was a huge army of Danes coming into Francia. They fought against the best armies of the time and absolutely dominated. The Franks couldn't do anything to stop them. We also have other things like the Siege of Paris. Do you think the French would have paid off the Vikings if they could actually win a fight against them? No. and there were many other payments of the sort, and other places the French simply paid off the Vikings to leave. The Franks also at multiple times signed treaties with Vikings. Frankish rulers like Charles the Fat, Louis the Pious, Lothair the First, they all signed treaties because they didn't want to fight the Vikings. These were the leaders of Frankie at the time. And then we have the Normans, for God's sake. Vikings who were invited. Vikings who were invited and were given a huge part of great land in northern France, and they effectively built their own society there. Do you think the Franks would have let them come in here and just settle if they could win a battle anytime? No, the Franks had every opportunity to stand against the Vikings, and they didn't because they couldn't. Charlemagne maybe could have, okay? Charlemagne was actually planning on invading Denmark in the very early years of the Viking Age, but Charlemagne died before this happened, so Franks are out of the running. Third contender, let's talk about the Saxons, or sometimes referred to as the East Franks, depending on when and where Saxon kings were even emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. So the Saxons were very, very strong in the Viking Age. They got destroyed by Charlemagne before the Viking Age, but after then, they became Christian, and they took a few generations to rebuild, and the Saxons were very, very powerful. But we don't really see them coming into conflict that much with the Scandinavians of the time. They seem to have pretty good relations on the most part. There were some small scuffles here and there, but really the only battle between the Saxons and the Vikings came in the late 900s at the time of Harald Bluetooth. Now, only one source talks about these events, and we are not sure how reliable it is. But in Heimskringla, it tells how the Saxons and Emperor Otto, along with all the other fighting forces of the Holy Roman Western Empire, they invaded Denmark. And at that time, they beat the Danes when the Danes were fighting by themselves with Harald Bluetooth. But a battle shortly before that, the Danes and Norwegians were united, and they won the battle. Really, it was just the Norwegians who did all the fighting there. So the Norwegians by themselves fought off the entire Holy Roman Empire, if we are to believe that source. Again, nobody in Western Europe could stand a fraction of a chance to win a battle against a united Scandinavia of the time. So to find a real challenger, guys, we have to go east. I'm not talking about the Slavs. Of course, the Slavs were amazing warriors too, but they were a lot of segregated smaller tribes and regions there. The Scandinavian settlers, by the way, the Rus Vikings, they really got no challenge from the Slavs in the east of Europe, and they were there to come in and pretty much able to start their own nation. This is what the Rus were. Scandinavian governed areas of Eastern Europe. So no, we have to go further east to see a good challenge for Scandinavia. Who was the most formidable force in the world at this time? You know, can we go really far east? Can we go to the samurai in Japan? What about Korea or China? They were definitely very powerful military forces earlier on in time, for sure. But interestingly enough, the Far East during the Viking Age was actually not a violent time. There wasn't much fighting done there at all. This was called the Heian period, and it almost exactly lines up with the Viking Age during those years, the 700s to the 1000s. And this was really, those years were a thriving time in the East, a period of peace and great growth, literature, art, technology, just a thriving time. They weren't known for their fighting forces at the time, but again, if we fast forward a few hundred years later, yes, we have the samurai. The Japanese were arguably the best fighting force in the world. I'm not that well versed in Asian history, so I'm not going to go into it so much, but if any of you are, let us know some good info in the comments with sources, please, not just opinions. We also have things like the Mongols. Oh yeah, Mongols are definitely powerful. They are one of my favorite times in history. So they came in and dominate most of Asia and even getting into Europe. So yes, of course, the Mongols were the #1 force in the world at the time of Genghis Khan. But again, this was in the 1200s, quite a bit after the Viking Age. What about other places like Persia, the Middle East? Absolutely, yes. Also, before the Viking Age, the strongest forces in the world was the Caliphate, without a doubt. the allegiance of kind of all the Muslim nations and forces attacking from the Middle East and North Africa. At this time, it was referred to as the Abbasid Caliphate. And they dominated all the way from the Middle East to Northern Africa, to the Western Mediterranean, into Spain and Portugal. It was hundreds of thousands of men from many nations, all united in a powerful army, united by ideas and religion, again, Islam. This lasted only until about the 900s, though. That is, until another force pushed back successfully. And this brings us to the main competitor, and the only formidable opponent to Scandinavia during the Viking Age, and that was the Byzantine, or Eastern Roman Empire. So yes, in reality, on paper, this was the strongest military force in the world at the time. Now, the Muslim powers were maybe the most powerful earlier on, because they had the Byzantines on the constant defensive, but from about the mid-900s, the Byzantines started to go on the attack and dominated the area for the next couple hundred years. This is exactly when the Viking Age is. So the Byzantine Empire and the armies was the largest and most organized military force in the world, and also the most well-funded economically. They were, one problem though, they were a bit smaller than in previous years. The population after the 900s plummeted. So scholars agree that at its peak, the Byzantine armed forces was going to be close to 400,000 men. But during its lowest point in the mid to late Viking Age, it was down to 118,000 men. Now still, 118,000 men is 10 times larger than any Viking army we have on record. But here's a few issues that would have weakened the Byzantine forces at the time. First, the Byzantine forces came more and more split up with time, and more split up during the Viking Age. They called these different groups of the armed forces there the strategoi. There were 18 strategoi in the early Viking Age, but by the late Viking Age there were almost 90. And these were quite separated military units, and they didn't fight together, united that much, so that's a problem there. Even bigger issue, and this is where I'm really getting to in this video, one Scandinavian was worth 10 Byzantine soldiers. You guys all know this. That's called the Varangian Guard. These were the most elite soldiers of the Byzantine Empire and the King's Guard, and guess what? They recruited mainly from the Rus Vikings living in Eastern Europe, and also from Vikings back home in Scandinavia. In the year 874, actually, the Rus and Byzantines almost got into an actual real conflict, so we could have been able to test out who was stronger. But they came to an agreement and a treaty with Emperor Basil I, and then from then on they were friends. Vikings served in the Byzantine army, helping the Byzantine Empire fight off the very powerful Caliphate, mostly. And it was actually a lot more Vikings in these armies than you think, okay? This wasn't just a couple men serving in the King's Royal Guard. At one point, in an expedition against the Emirate of Crete in the year 902, there were 700 Varangian Vikings serving in that battle. Another one of about 415 Varangians were involved in the Italian expedition of 936. The biggest one was in 988, when Vladimir of Kiev, the ruler there, and his Norse name, he was actually still Norse, his name was Valdemar, and he was still pagan, and he was speaking Old Norse, remember, he was not just some Eastern European prince, he was a Viking, he was Norse, okay? He sent 6,000 men to Basel as part of a military assistance. Guys, the Vikings were the whole reason the Byzantine Empire was so powerful at the time. It was because they were helping them. So yeah, of course we know the Vikings were much bigger, stronger, more fierce warriors than any other men in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, but not only that, they were the most loyal. We have multiple Byzantine sources speaking about how loyal these Norsemen were, and how they would only fight for their lord, and they would fight to the death without question. This was opposed to the men in the Mediterranean, who fought for basically whoever paid best. But a Norse oath and loyalty was for life. Again, these are not my ideas. There are multiple sources for this. I'll put them up here and down below. So yeah, the Byzantines and Eastern Roman Empire was the largest and most powerful military force in the world on paper. But the average Byzantines, they would have never realized that. They would have never realized how small numbers Scandinavian armies actually had, okay? The only reality that the Byzantines would have known and seen is, oh shit, look at these giant blonde men from Scandinavia fighting for our emperor. Thank God they are on our side. I would not want to fight them. There's only a few hundred of them, and they are the most elite fighting force in our whole army. We better not fuck with them. Last thing we want is for tens of thousands of them to come from Scandinavia and decide they want to conquer us. Okay, yes, of course, Byzantines were much larger numbers, better funded, better trained. They probably would have outnumbered a united Scandinavian army 10 to 1. Vikings may not have won in a straight up, frontline battle against the Byzantine Empire. But that's not what would have happened in actual practice. What would have happened if Scandinavia actually decided to invade the Eastern Roman Empire? They would have sailed in, decimated any force they came across. The Byzantines would have ran away, fearing death, especially once the paychecks stopped coming in, unlike the loyal, bloodthirsty Norsemen. And they would have continued on city after city after city until the Byzantine Empire was on its knees and some Viking king named Olav took over and he sat his ass right on the throne of the emperor and ruled from there. That's what would have happened if the Scandinavians actually decided to do so, but they didn't. Okay, so we'll never know for sure. However, there were many other events that shaped the world just like this, and that's exactly what we are covering in the next video, is the 5-part series and how Scandinavia really was way more powerful and significant than you all know. So stay tuned, those are coming next week, but that's all for today. Vi ses nästa gång.